This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. Now imagine that you're driving a car and the brakes stop working. To your horror, you're approaching a busy street market, and many people might be killed if you run into them. The only way you can prevent a catastrophe is by turning fast to the right. Unfortunately, a lonely pedestrian might be killed if you do so. So should you turn? Well, many people say you should. After all, killing one is better than killing many. But here's the problem. Following the same logic, shouldn't you kill an individual, almost any individual, right now if you could collect their organs and donate them to people in dire need of one? In this case, too, you will kill one to save many. Yet very few are willing to do so. So why is this? Now, both of the scenarios I painted above are somewhat more realistic variations of what have become known as the trolley problems in philosophy. The trolley problems continue to elicit conversations amongst philosophers and psychologists, and they really have a whole internet meme culture built around them. And for years, I was not really convinced of their value. They seem to squeeze ethics into these kind of really narrow boxes, yeses and nos, and they seem for me to neglect a lot of the real texture of life. But I've changed my mind, and I've done so largely thanks to Peter Railton. A professor of philosophy at UC Michigan, Railton, used to share my skepticism actually about the trolley problems, but he too changed his mind, and he had a lot of in-depth conversations about these issues with his students. And having those conversations, Railton came to see that the problems can actually reveal quite a lot about our morality. So I decided to invite him on the show. And we really get to a lot of things. We get to the original trolley problems in the 60s, 70s. We get to new insights from neuroscience that supposedly kind of solved them in the early noughties. We come to some very interesting insights that Railton has himself gathered from his students. We also talk about morals around the world. We talk about comparisons between humans and chimpanzees. And we finish with a short conversation on moral progress and some speculations about how the insights from this conversation can shed light on the really rapid acceptance of gay rights during Railton's own lifetime. If you're new to On Humans, this is a series which features conversations with philosophers, scientists, and historians. Each of these episodes gives a possibility for really anyone, I hope, to tune in without any background knowledge and end with a somewhat nuanced understanding of the scholarship on the topic. And each episode will finish with my guest's reflection on humanity. To make it easier for you to follow the conversation and also to dig deeper and use it as a basis for more self-study. As always, the show notes includes names of people and technical terms mentioned in this conversation. If you're new to On Humans and want to hear more of this, make sure to subscribe to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows. You can also subscribe to the On Humans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com. I want to take a moment here to thank all the generous people who make On Humans possible by supporting me at patreon.com/onhumans. If you're someone who tunes in regularly and might want to join this wonderful group of people, you can do so indeed at patreon.com/onhumans. And you can really chip even a small amount of money. And while doing that, you will also get access to some extra content, such as early drafts from a book that I'm writing on, well, you guessed it, On Humans. But let's get back to the show. I bring to you Peter Railton. Professor Peter Railton, welcome to On Humans.
Very glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
I have a degree in philosophy and psychology, as I told you earlier, so I couldn't escape having conversations with fellow students about the trolley problem. Now, I think the trolley problem is something that many people who haven't even studied philosophy, it might be the one thing they know from it. But I actually think that most people couldn't actually tell what really is the problem, what really happens. So what exactly is the trolley problem?
Well, it's actually a set of problems. And the problem itself is the verdicts that people give across a number of cases and how those are supposed to fit together. And I'll describe the cases briefly. But the key thing is that they don't seem to fit together. They don't seem to cohere in an obvious way. And so there's been a long search to see if there are any principles or any idea of a theory that could explain this pattern of judgment. So classic trolley problem. You're in a city, you see a trolley coming down a track. The driver is slumped over the controls, obviously unable to control the trolley. It's heading straight down the track, and you can see that down the track there are 5 workmen in a tunnel who couldn't escape if the trolley approached. And you happen to be standing next to a lever. And the lever could send it on a side track where there's just one worker standing in the way. And so the question is, should you throw the switch to send it on the sidetrack? that would result in the death of one worker, but save the 5 others. That's the first case, and let's call that switch. And when I give that problem to my students, about 80, 90% say you should throw the switch. And this is not just my students. This is true in a very large number of populations. It seems like a very robust result.
Yeah, there are a lot of cross-cultural studies on this, and I think that there's always like, it's a bit of a, is the glass, half full or half empty? Is that, yes, there are differences between populations in the exact numbers, but it tends to be the case across the world that the majority will pull the switch.
Yeah. And you're right about the cross-cultural data, which is interesting. And the part of the key takeaway there is that the asymmetries that are found, for example, in my undergraduate population, tend to crop up even if the magnitudes are somewhat different. So what's the asymmetry? Well, here's another problem. You're in a city, you're walking along, you see a trolley coming down the track, driver slumped over the controls, and you look down, you can see that there are 5 workmen in a tunnel down the track who will be struck and killed by the trolley if nothing is done. And now this time, though, instead of standing next to a convenient switch, you're up on a footbridge looking down, and there happens to be standing next to you a very large man. Now, somehow you know that the trolleys in the city are equipped with an automatic braking system, such that if they encounter a large obstacle on the track, they'll come to a halt. And you don't have a switch to throw. You're so thin that you would not work as a stop to the trolley. But this large gentleman conveniently would. And so the question is, just before the trolley arrives, should you push this man off the footbridge down onto the track, where he'll be immediately struck by the trolley and it will come to a stop. Once again, one person who was not previously at risk will be killed, but 5 down the track will not. And let's call that footbridge, unimaginatively. And if you put that to my undergraduate students, maybe 25, 30% will say you should push. And that's, again, a fairly common result. It's very robust over the years. So that's an asymmetry with the first case, because it looks as if the first case is about sacrificing 1 to save 5, even though the one is not currently at risk. You're willing to do that, reluctantly, of course. But in the second case, it looks as if you're not willing to sacrifice 1 to save 5, or at least 75% of the students are not. And so the question is why? What's the difference between them?
And by the way, before we go into the difference, I might just want to address my original worry, which was when I heard this for the first time, I was like, look, this is kind of nonsense. Like, there's so many hypotheticals here around this really large gentleman being able to push. I mean, there's so many uncertainties that just the fact that it's actually an uncertain course of action would make me not want to do it. So this is not really about what it's supposed to be about. But then I kind of changed my mind. I don't know what you think about this, but the way I changed my mind was to consider the pretty much logically identical case, which is very realistic, which is organ harvesting. That the footbridge scenario is logically very, very similar to organ harvesting, where you kill one person to take 5 organs out of their body, give them to 5 people who would die without them. And this is something that, again, I think even less than 25% would say that it would be an advisable strategy from the government to start organ harvesting.
Yeah.
But I think what we've established is, okay, we have an interesting asymmetry in the original trolley problem. It's not quite as far-fetched as it might sound like at first. It's a silly, simplified way of making a very real point. And we find an asymmetry, and now we have a detective work to do, which is to explain where does this asymmetry come from. I mean, the original explanation, if I remember, I mean, this was something like the trolley problem was first suggested by Philippa, right, in the 60s, if I remember right. And I think that what she suggested was something such as the means-end distinction, which is that in the first case, I am not using the victim as a means to my ends. It's a really sad, tragic thing that one person is there on the other tunnel. But if they wouldn't be there, I would be really happy. I would rejoice from the fact that I didn't have to kill anyone. Whereas in the second case scenario, where there's a large gentleman, if the large gentleman suddenly escapes, I will be sad because they have to die for my project to succeed, so to speak. And so I'm using this person as an instrument, and that this would be the explanation for the difference. First of all, am I getting foot right? Do I remember this right? And where does the story go from here?
Yeah, that was one of the explanations given. And it wasn't long before, and I think Judith Jarvis Thompson gets credit for this, another case came along, and it's called loop. And in loop, the setup is very similar to switch. You're standing next to a switch. You could switch the trolley onto a side track. But the trolley track, and if you have to sort of envisage this, it actually makes a big loop. And so if you switch it to the side track and there's no one on the side track, it will swing around and come and hit the workers from the other direction. But if there happens to be a large worker on the side track, then if you throw the switch, it will go down the side track, hit the large worker, and stop. And the 5 workers will not be hit.
And so following the suggestion I just gave, the means end distinction, it would seem like now I am using the poor victim as a tool for my purposes, which is a good purpose, saving the 5, but now the person is again not just a sad victim that I would rather not see, but it's actually part of the design of my actions.
Yeah, instead of, if the man were to step off, the workman were to step off the track, I don't think you'd be happy in any event, but it would spoil the intention.
Yeah.
And it has the structure such that if the individual seems to assent to loop, then you can't explain footbridge using someone as a means rather than an end, or rather using a means in addition to being an end. So if I give that to my students, what do you suppose they say, the loop case?
The loop case, I mean, if your students follow the general trend that I've seen in the empirical studies, it's much closer to the case 1, to the switch case, so much higher approval. Not quite as high as the original switch, but much higher than with the footbridge, the throwing the large gentleman on the tracks.
Yeah, it might be 80%, for example.
Okay.
And so we've now got a kind of a hierarchy. At the top, we've got the case of switch. Then you got the case of loop, almost as acceptable. And then much less acceptable, you've got footbridge. So this created a puzzle, and philosophers have been scratching their heads about this.
And of course, there are 2 puzzles. There is the what I guess in philosophy lingo would be said is the descriptive and the prescriptive or normative puzzle. So one puzzle is why do people answer as they do? And the other puzzle is what should we answer, what would be the right thing to answer. And so why don't you take us forward? What happens next?
Okay, so where do we go next? Well, one place we go is to develop ever more complex philosophical theories. Foote wanted to emphasize that this was a sort of anti-consequentialist form of reasoning.
Yes. So we shouldn't just look at morality as a way to maximize, in a utilitarian fashion, maximize the happiness and minimize the suffering, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you take a kind of hardline utilitarian approach, it looks like you should sacrifice the large gentleman.
And this was meant to give people a strong reason for thinking there's something the matter with at least standard utilitarianism. But what became very important, and this was around the year 2000, was attempts to explain it on psychological grounds, and then asking, is this psychological ground anything that we should give a moral weight to? And so one of the early experiments was done by Josh Greene and colleagues. It was an fMRI experiment looking at brain activity while people were answering these problems. And what they thought they'd found anyhow was that switch cases get activity in short-term memory, cognitive areas, cost-benefit areas. This is back when people were pretty confident talking about areas. And in the personal one, we get a strong negative response in the affective or emotional areas, and a less strong response in the cognitive areas. And so it was argued that this shows that the difference between these cases is not a matter of moral reasoning or principle, but just that the footbridge case excites a strong affective reaction.
Throwing a large gentleman to his death is something that gives us kind of the emotional reaction to that is so large that it overrides any reasoning that might be going underneath.
Exactly. Some of the advocates, some of the people practicing this research did think that this spoke in favor of rejecting the idea that these footbridge and trolley cases in general were a problem for consequentialism, because if it was just a matter of an emotional response and indeed a reduced cognitive response, then it's not clear why we should give it moral weight.
Yes. It was a kind of not a wise, but I don't know, reptilian response that comes. I think this is where things get interesting when it comes to explaining people's responses. And now we have one psychological theory on the table, which is that humans can reason about morality, and when they reason according to a kind of utilitarian consequentialist, whatever term we want to pick, way of, well, the better outcome is the outcome where less people die, and then we should do whatever we can to do it. But then we also have an emotional gut reaction against certain kinds of actions, for example, pushing large gentlemen on rail tracks, and that can kind of override our more reasoned morality. Would that be a kind of fair summary of the theory one, psychological theory number one?
That's one way in which it was read, yeah. And I guess the predominant way in which it was read. This was also at a time when dual system models of the brain were gaining traction.
Yeah, so this is, for example, like what people might know from, for example, Daniel Kahnemann's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, this idea that we have kind of two systems, right? Where we have the kind of reasonable, rational system that we can deliberate with, but then sometimes when our intuitions kick in, they go all over the place, and we become silly animals.
So yeah, they may be predictable, as they are in the trolley cases. People, their intuitions can be predicted pretty well, but the thought is that those are being done by system one, which is, according to Kahnemann at any rate, not involved in logic and statistics. It's what is going on spontaneously all the time and helping us get a general sense of the world, but it's not involved in controlled deliberative reasoning. And so we shouldn't think that the intuitive response has special credibility. Once we can see that it's these two different systems at work, and they're always active in the mind, but there's sometimes a competition between system one and system two responses. And since many thought of system one as effective, this fit the analysis of the trolley problem. So it was a fast, not statistically valid emotional reaction. So that's where the literature was. And this was, as I say, it congrued with this a lot of the dual systems thinking out there, and it congrued with a commonsensical picture of the brain as having quick emotive responses and having slower deliberative responses. This goes way back to Plato.
We have the lizard brain and the human neocortex, or we have the the limbic system versus the prefrontal cortex or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the limbic system is more mammalian than lizard, but ours is anyhow.
Yes. And I mean, to be honest, one neuroscientist I had on the show, I think it was off the record, but she said that if she gets mentioned the word reptilian brain, it will become a whole 1 hour lecture why it doesn't make any sense to call it reptilian brain. But I think that's the kind of catchword in the public imagination, more than an accurate description of the anatomical reality. But let's not stay there for too long. Let's continue. I think that we've seen, so in around 60s, 70s, we start getting these trolley problems in the philosophical literature. Then we start getting in the 2000s, we think that we have the answer not from philosophy, from psychology and neuroscience, which is that some of these cases invoke our rational brain, some of these invoke our heuristic, affective, emotional brain. And the subtle suggestion there by many of the scholars is that maybe that we should just try to use our rational brain. What happens next?
Well, part of what happens next is some people start questioning this emotional rational distinction. So starting in the 2000s, again, coming from neuroscience, people found that a lot of the activity that we might think of as rational activity, including statistics, seems to be being done in the affective system. And they studied in great detail that animals are able to do what's called nearly optimal foraging, balancing costs and benefits, food values, risks, and so on. And so it looks as if this system we share with the mammals is actually a statistically quite strong cost-benefit oriented system that explains why this very complicated problem of foragers explains why it can be solved by a rat.
And with humans also, you had, Antonio Damasio is maybe the first name that comes to my mind around this work. And his team had these really striking studies of how the kind of emotional reaction of, for example, people are playing statistical gambling tasks. When they are picking the wrong deck, they're doing the wrong thing, statistically speaking. They might not realize they're doing the wrong thing, but you can notice it from the skin conduct, from the sweats on their palms. Their kind of emotional brain knows already that they are doing the wrong thing, even if they think that they might be doing the right thing. And also when you had brain damage on emotional, quote unquote, emotional areas, people became actually worse at these kinds of statistical gambling tasks.
That's an example that the brain was doing intuitive statistics, even at a level we don't easily call up cognitively. And then it turns out that the same areas are involved, or same networks are involved in complicated tasks such as navigation, and so the confidence in the idea that the brain really is a dual system eroded, and that we think of these two systems as characterized as, one is good at statistics and logic, and the other one is not, and so that's going on, and so if you buy the idea that the affective system is in effect a statistical modeling system, that it's learning the model of an environment, then you think, well, okay, well, maybe in the moral case, something like that is going on.
So maybe the response to not throw the large gentleman off the footbridge is not as kind of heuristic and unreasoned as it was supposed to be. Maybe there is some hidden wisdom in that decision.
Yes. And at the same time, some people were discovering that if you do a psychological profile of the people most likely to advocate push on footbridge, they don't look like altruists or people who are highly motivated by consequentialist reasoning. They tend to show a higher score in sociopathy scales, more indifference to others.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And so, this began to suggest to people that actually there was more at work in this push response than are you a utilitarian or not?
Yeah. Not to claim that the listeners or students who did click push necessarily are completely uninterested in others, but as a general trend, it didn't look like these other utilitarian, carefully minded philosophers. These were more ruthless, callous, less empathetic individuals. Yeah. Okay.
And this, like everything else, is controversial. But anyhow, there was this body of literature.
There was more than one paper, I think, is worth saying. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Quite a number of researchers who came up with very similar outcomes. Yeah. And so here's the question. If what's going on is actually more complicated, if among other things, the affective system is both statistically sophisticated and it's an evaluative system, it's looking at rewards and values, then the question is maybe the way that it's modeling these situations going to help us explain the pattern of judgments in the trolley scenarios. And at the same time, I was finding in my classes that there were certain ways in which, by asking some further questions about the trolley problem, I was able to elicit an interesting body of responses. What I found was that if I asked them certain questions about these trolley problem cases, it seems to suggest that they are working with a complex implicit model. So I'll ask you, suppose one day you come home and your roommate's all upset. Why? I said, well, I was in this terrible situation. I was out in the street and there was this trolley coming and workers in the track, and there was a switch. I could throw the switch, but it killed this workman. I didn't. I feel terrible about that. I killed a person. So if your roommate recounts that story to you, would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? Suppose your roommate was all upset when you came back one day, and he said, well, there was this terrible situation, the runaway trolley, and there was no way to stop it, it seemed, except to push this large gentleman next to me on the footbridge into the trolley's path. And I looked around, I couldn't think of anything else to do, and so I did this, and I feel terrible about it. Would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? And what you find is there's a huge shift toward less in the case of footbridge, giving the push verdict. And in the switch case, it doesn't tend to produce a shift in trust. by and large, people will trust their roommate just about the same as before, sometimes maybe a little bit more. And so for some reason, people are thinking someone who would do this seems untrustworthy. And then if you ask about loop, you'll find that people give the same kind of answer they do in switch. Would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? And there's just a little slight shift maybe in the direction of more, but certainly not less.
And so basically the question of would you trust someone who does this more or less pretty much tracks the original answers to, is this okay? Is this the right thing to do? Or what would you do?
Yeah. And so you could think, well, that's the kind of question you could answer if you had a model of the situation. And if what you're doing when you're making moral judgments is, in effect, forming a model of the scenario and asking, well, what kind of a person would do this? Then what you'd expect is that there'd be a difference in the cases that could explain perhaps the difference between footbridge and switch. And so then I started inventing new scenarios. Some of them involve direct physical force pushing someone, and they don't produce this huge shift to distrust. Some of them involve no direct physical force and produce a huge shift to distrust. And so that suggested to me that, no, there's actually kind of a complex understanding involved here. So I'll just give you two quick examples. Suppose the situation is one in which the trolley's coming down the track as before. There are 5 workers down the track. And there seems to be nothing you can do, but there's a shed on the other side of the track. And there's a very large man standing beside the shed who can't see the trolley coming, but can see you because you're on the other side of the track. And if you were to go this way, addressing that large man would step in your direction onto the track, and the trolley would hit him and stop.
So there is no physical force, but in other ways, it's very similar to the push from the footbridge. Okay.
Yeah, there's no direct physical force, just a hand motion. And you say, well, maybe there's something about, communicating an intention or something.
And wait a minute, what's the response to this signaling the person to come on track? Is that more similar to the push that most people don't agree with it?
That's right. Yeah, and it's quite
that would be my own response.
Yeah, it's quite a strong reaction.
Yeah.
And so, okay, well, is there a comparison case? Suppose trolley's coming down the track as before. There are 5 workmen on the track. There's one workman standing beside the track. They're facing you. You're down the track. They don't see the trolley coming. If you were to go that way, the workers would step off the track, 5, but the one who was beside the track would step in the same direction, and be on the track and be hit and killed. So should you wave like that to the workers? Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, I at least I would say this is easier. For some reason, that would be significantly easier to do, and it would very, very much feel like pulling the switch.
Yeah,
right? You're causing one event which leads to one person dying instead of 5 person dying, instead of feeling like you're killing one.
Good. Yeah, and that's the very common response of the students. And so then you ask them the trust question about these cases. Would you take the beckon case and the wave case? Sure enough, in the beckon case, there's a big shift toward distrust with regard to the roommate. In the beckon case, where you're gesturing to the man to step on the track, and there isn't any strong shift toward distrust in the wave case. So it looks as if, well, that doesn't seem to be about proximity or physical force, but it seems as if there's this pattern, which is you line up the cases, and a whole series of cases produce a positive or zero trust response. Others produce a negative, maybe strongly negative response, and that tracks very well the judgments that people are giving about the scenarios.
Yeah, so there is a strong correlation. But hold on, I mean, there is a correlation, but of course one can ask, which way does it go? Is it that people say this is the wrong thing to do because they think this is something that an untrustworthy person would do? Or do they say a person doing this would be an untrustworthy person because they're doing something I don't approve of? So which way do you think the arrow goes?
Yeah, so what you need to do is do some more questions. And one thing that you find is that even the percentage of people who would increase their distrust in many cases is larger than the percentage of people who would give the verdict in something like footbridge or
Okay, so even people who would say it's the right thing to push
Yeah.
typically would say, and by the way, I would distrust the person who actually does it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, interesting. That is interesting.
And now I can't track individual students because it's anonymous, but if you look at the numbers, what you'll see is it'd be very hard to explain it just in terms of the judgment of right and wrong. Okay. Here's another scenario. You were the person who had to pull the switch or push the man or wave or beckon, and you've now gone to the family of the person who died because you think you should speak to them. And so the question is, as you're coming to them, as you're standing on the doorstep or whatever, what do you expect their response would be? Do you expect their response would be, well, to show some understanding and sympathy, but to still be very upset and unhappy about the situation? Would you expect their response to be neutral, or would you expect it to be the case that they would be very upset and not understand and feel that what you've done is seriously?
Well, pushing the large gentleman would almost certainly get very, very little sympathy from the family. Is my my quick take on this.
Yeah, and that's what happens. And again, you can't pull apart these correlations very well, at least not with the kinds of questions that I ask in the setting which I do it. But you do get a kind of a package picture here in which if you ask questions about the motives or typical characteristics of a person who would perform this action, or if you ask questions about how people would tend to view the action, or if you ask questions about the appropriateness of the action, these tend to vary together.
And important, they vary in a way that looks like there is a certain kind of primacy to the what kind of a person would do this, how would they be perceived by the victim's family, and that those tend to be stronger. There's usually more agreement, even stronger agreement about that.
So in that setting, then, it begins to look as if people are doing something like modeling situations, and modeling it not just from their own perspective, but they're able instantaneously, really, to give answers to these other questions. And so then the literature on the neural basis of moral judgment began to evolve, and people shifted away from the idea of there being specific areas. It looked as if moral judgments drew upon domain general competencies, and it looks as if the default system is heavily involved in moral judgment, which is the same system that's involved in things like episodic memory, semantic competency, envisioning the future, theory of mind, trying to figure out what's going on in other people's minds.
Simulating different situations.
So on that picture there, the default system, well, it's looking at your past experience. It's looking at your idea of what the attitudes are of the individuals that are involved. You're simulating scenarios. You're trying to predict characteristics of the situation or the agents involved. And so it looks as if you're doing what would have been predicted by this other body of data suggesting that something like modeling was going on. And if that's right, then you may have an explanation for the asymmetries in the trolley problem that does nothing to discredit any one of those typical responses, and actually may do something to help explain why there are reasonable responses. And it's a feature of those responses that they are very robust. If you take the Kahnemann and Tversky cases, and or if you explain it to people and say, here's what's going on, they'll say, oh, okay, I realize I shouldn't have given that response.
Oh, so people can self-correct themselves. Yeah. Yes. And am I right in guessing that they don't self-correct themselves in the same way with trolley problems, for example?
And that's the thing. Trolley problems, year in and year out, people give similar responses. They give fairly similar responses at the beginning of the year, the end of the year, after having thought about it for a long time. And so those have a kind of resilience, robustness that's quite different from these little statistical cases.
I see. And so this all suggests that maybe this is more the kind of wisdom of the emotions. But what would you then, in summary, what would you say then, if you were pressed to give just one answer, couple of sentences, I don't know, one paragraph answer, what would be the answer then if someone just comes to you and asks, okay, after all of this talk, why are people more likely to pull the switch than push the large gentleman?
What I would say is people have had a long life, at least by the time they're college students, or typically show up in these psychological experiments. They have seen many kinds of interactions that have some similarities to this situation. They've seen people's responses to those. All the while, they have been modeling those situations just as they model causal reactions in their world. They've been modeling the states of mind that seem to be involved. They've been modeling the consequences characteristic of them. They've been modeling the way they change relations among people. And so they have this very complex moral competency based on this capacity for evaluative and causal modeling. And you're just getting a display of it when you're asking these questions. And the display suggests that this feature of these seemingly inexplicable asymmetries actually is tapping into their underlying competencies. And so my thought is that there's be no reason at all to think that there's something discreditable about the difference between these judgments. And putting it in normative terms, there are various kinds of consequentialism that would be perfectly willing to say you shouldn't give the push verdict in footbridge. So there are rule consequentialisms. Would this be a good rule for people to follow? There are trait consequentialists. Would someone with the best kind of character or the best kinds of motivations and positions, would they perform this action? That's a kind of consequentialism. Mill's consequentialism looks a lot like that in some places.
Well, let's take stock. I mean, I think that the main summary then would be that you think that when we really think through this question, we shouldn't take a kind of elitist ivory tower philosophy scorn at the average response of people and say, oh, you're just silly.
Yeah.
Nor should we say, oh, all this consequentialism, utilitarianism are wrong. This is clearly about some kind of what in the technical terminology is called deontological ethics. So, it's all about a certain kind of you never do this, you never do that rules. Maybe it's a bit of a more messy situation where there's more kind of wisdom to the average response than meets the eye. And the wisdom lies in, for example, the fact that, look, just factually speaking, it seems to be people who are high on psychopathy, for example, who tend to be willing to push people. And so if you don't want to cultivate that part of your character, well, don't be a person who pushes. What do you think of that as a kind of a summary so far?
Well, yeah, again, I would begin by qualifying, saying this is all based on, these kinds of experiments, either my little meager experiments or the experiments that are done by much more serious people. And so every part of this has empirical problems. But yes, I think the picture holds together in something like the way you were describing. So, I guess I say I'm partly on a jag here to say, don't write people off. So, it's easy to get down on humanity. Very easy. Good grief. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the big question here is that we kind of have two extremes, where one extreme is a kind of ivory tower. Oh, all the people are wrong. I have a theory of ethics, so I know what's right and nobody else knows what's right. Okay, we don't want to go there, it seems. At least you don't want to go there. And I personally don't want to go there. Another extreme, though, is to say that, well, whatever people say is moral is moral. And that doesn't seem to really hold water. And I think that it's actually very difficult with the trolley problem, because we did mention earlier that there is this really large cross-cultural body of evidence, that these are pretty robust and pretty cross-cultural. But of course, there are two important caveats. One is that, well, what was it, 25%, 20% of, for example, your students do not agree with the majority. They would probably have a different take than they probably wouldn't be. I don't know if they would be convinced by anything that we've said. They would say, no, you guys are just walking around in a circle. I mean, look, you have to save as many lives as you can, period. And the other important caveat is that I am aware of one study where the large majority of people agreed that something like the push is the right thing to do. And this was done with an indigenous community in Central America. I think it was Nicaragua. And this actually gets really messy, because before people conclude that, indigenous small scale societies, they are all very utilitarian. Well, also the other extreme has happened. So there is one indigenous community from, I think it was Indonesia, where you get the opposite one. So almost no one even wants to pull the switch. They just want to let the trolley go as it's going. And so you find these really, really big extremes when you leave a kind of industrialized setting. So you don't get the extremes when you leave Western industrialized settings, but you do get extremes when you leave, modern cities and so on. So how should we think about that? Should we say that, well, they have learned different rules about what's good in their society, period? Should we say that there might be a way in which they are more right than us or more wrong than us? If we take a more relativistic view, what do we do when we meet, someone who has learned the rule that, enslaving people is okay in my community, so it's obviously okay? I mean, we get into very, very traditional, difficult questions around just the meaning of ethics. So that's a lot of stuff. Yeah, that's a lot to pick. But what would you say?
That's a lot. Yeah, I don't know. I'll be able to address it more than a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
So there are lots of people who've done cross-cultural psychology, and what they find is that populations don't seem to vary randomly. If you look at, for example, something like the ultimatum problem, which is a problem in game theory in which you have two individuals. One of them you give a certain sum of money to. You tell that individual, you can do whatever you want with this money. You could give some of it to the other person, or you could keep it all. But I'm telling you that if you offer a fraction to the other person and they refuse it, nobody gets anything.
Or if you offer them nothing and they refuse the nothing.
Yeah, no one will get anything. Yeah, that's right. And so what happens if you, as some anthropologists and economists did, you go around the world looking at small-scale societies in various different parts of the world, and you ask them, how much money should you give on the initial offer? And should you accept an offer, if it's below a certain level, something like that? And you don't find the same answer, but you do find a strong correlation between the answers that they give and their way of life. So if society that depends upon some kind of collective action, for example, there's a whale hunting small society in which they all have to get out in a boat or several boats, and it requires a great deal of coordinated activity. Yeah. They tend to be very egalitarian in responses to this.
So they offer half of the money to their body.
And they refuse even, smaller offers. And so, and then if you look at another group, which are herders, where the individuals living off on their own, often in a remote area, they have to depend almost entirely on their own resources to protect their flock from predators or to keep them from disappearing or protect them from malicious individuals wandering around. And so if you look at societies with that pattern of sociability, where they earn their lives that way, they give quite different judgments, less egalitarian judgments. You're allowed to keep...
Okay, so shepherds give less.
Shepherds give less and accept less. And so the idea is, well, there is cultural variation, but this shouldn't lead us into some kind of relativism. It's more what I would call relationalism, that relative to conditions of existence, some forms of morality will make more sense than others in terms of having the capacity to promote positive sum outcomes rather than zero-sum outcomes. If that's right, then people in these various traditional societies are learning. Here's a set of norms or a set of values about how to interact with each other that functions effectively within this context. Now, that doesn't mean it's the right morality or something like that, but it means when we think about morality, we should think that it's a set of capacities to solve very basic problems in human existence, such that we can live together better than we would live separately. And if you think of it in those terms, then of course you'll get some variation depending upon the material conditions or cultural tradition. In some societies, you get trolley problem verdicts that suggest, and then indeed you find this in society, a strong belief that the course of nature shouldn't be interfered with. And so you shouldn't go in throwing switches and things like that, because obviously...
Yeah. And by the way, I think interestingly, you do have a little bit more of that, for example, in China compared to America. So that, yes, the pattern is the same in China and America, but in the first instance of flipping the switch, Chinese are less likely to... It's still a majority of Chinese are going to flip the switch, but it's a smaller majority than in America, for example. And I think that's explained by a kind of Taoist, non-action, letting nature run its course, believe in fate, those kinds of cultural trends.
Or that would be a viable explanation, and as far as we know now. And so I would urge that we think in relational terms rather than relativistic terms. and that we think of morality as more a set of solutions to fundamental problems that people face that'll be recurring problems in any society. There are some that are very general, found almost everywhere. Everywhere we find language, for example, we'll find certain kinds of norms of communication.
Of not lying for yourself, personal pleasure, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is, you'll come across a culture in which you say, gee, these people don't tell the truth very much. They say, oh, yes, I'll come see you on Sunday. But they don't come, and they don't seem upset about not coming. And then you can say, well, no one in that society would take the fact that someone just said, I'm going to come to see you on Sunday, as a commitment on their part. And so there are different norms of what constitutes a committal act.
Yes, but once you've committed, it's always something people should respect. Yes, that makes sense. No, but I think that's really, it makes a lot of sense, and it reminds me of what I in one of the very, very first episodes I had Philip Kitcher on the show, and his take on morality was, I mean, it resonates very much with what you said. I mean, what he was promoting was a view of morality where basically humans have we have a kind of spontaneous altruism, generosity in us. So sometimes things go well just by kind of our spontaneous actions, but they don't go well enough, and there are too many conflicts that come up if people just follow their gut instincts, which are sometimes altruistic, sometimes selfish. And therefore we need tools, kind of social technologies, I think was his term. We need social technologies which reduce conflict, solve communal problems, and that's where morality comes from. And so it's not a kind of relativism where everybody just picks whatever they want. It's a kind of tool, and some tools work better in other contexts than others, but we can evaluate tools as doing a better or worse job based on that kind of I don't know, without going too much into the details of Kitcher's theory. Is that pretty much what you're also suggesting?
Yeah, without going into the details, it's kind of within that vicinity, certainly. So there are lots of questions here. For example, well, what counts as working for a given?
Yes, well, that was going to be my next question. Yes.
And why would we say one rather than another? And why would evolution care one way or another? So there's a lot that has to be said here. But it does seem to be the case, for example, and this is work that Tomasello has done, which is, again, controversial with chimpanzees and comparing them with human infants. Chimpanzees are extremely intelligent and capable, even at a young age. And yet there are certain problems which they seem to have inherent difficulty in solving that infants solve rather well. And I'll just mention one. This is a famous gummy bear experiment. If you have two cages side by side with a door between, you have a dominant chimp in one and a subordinate chimp in the other. You have a board with some food on it with ropes, such that if one person pulls, the food won't come. But if two people pull at the same time, or two animals pull at the same time, the food will come. So does the subordinate chimp learn to open the door, let the dominant chimp in, and they'll both pull on the rope and get food? And the answer is yes, they can learn that. So that's an impressive piece of coordination that they're capable of learning, and an important kind of benefit. But on Tomasello's view, as I understand it, if you put the food in a single bowl at the center of the board, then when they pull the board in, the dominant chimp will push the subordinate chimp aside and take all the food.
Yeah, take all of the food. Whereas with human infants, even with young children, if they pull the same rope, they instinctively share anything that comes.
Yeah, and they enjoy that. They seem to have a positive response.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really important point, by the way. I think that's a really important point, which gets often missed in the kind of results section of the article. Yeah, seeing the videos, it's a really pleasurable moment, and I think importantly, it's if they pull two separate ropes and to get two separate piles of candy, and one gets more than the other, they don't share. So it's not that everybody always shares, but there is something about doing a joint action, pulling the same rope, which leads really automatically, it seems, human children to share. I think it's a really good example of something that's Well, what exactly does it show? How do you see the relevance?
Think of this as a modeling challenge. The chimpanzee does not seem to be modeling, look, if I take all the food, the dominant one, then this is going to stop, because that's what happens. The subordinate chimp stops opening the door and nobody gets any food. So if I were to take all the food, this would result in a situation in which no one gets any food from this. And then I can use that remote fact about some possible future outcome to constrain my behavior right now. So even though I want to take all the food and even though I want to be dominant, I won't do that. So I am willing to restrict my behavior for the sake of this longer term outcome. And so in that sense, you could think that there's a kind of a solution to many problems, which is if we could collaborate in a joint act, we could solve this longer term problem. But if we can't, even if we can cooperate the way chimpanzees can't cooperate, then these problems are going to remain outside of our.
Yeah, and there are people who like, for example, Oliver Scott Curry is a philosopher and anthropologist who has, he has a theory that's literally called morality as cooperation. Basically, the idea that you take a bunch of cooperative challenges that any social animal would face, and you look at what would be some reasonable solutions to them as social norms, and lo and behold, you kind of get a lot of human morality, cross-cultural morality pops up as kind of tools to solve cooperative problems. One issue I would have with that, I think it's a really good start, by the way. It's not that I think it's a bad start, but I think it's not enough, because it doesn't take into account cases where you don't get benefit from yourself. That's a kind of enlightened self-interest view of morality, and I think a lot of morality can be viewed as enlightened self-interest. Like in that chimpanzee case, if the dominant always tries to grab everything, the cooperation breaks down and soon no one gets anything. Okay, great. Very easy textbook example of where cooperation pays off in the long run. But the most, even with chimpanzees, you see self-sacrificial behavior. So let's go back to the trollic problem, and this time is you are the large gentleman. Should you jump? And whether we say that you should jump or not, I think that no one would say that it would be an immoral thing to jump and save the five. And we have, plenty of real-life scenarios where this happens. Assuming that we want to accommodate self-sacrificial behavior within our view of morality and ethics, I think we need more than cooperation, more than this kind of enlightened self-interest as the goal that morality is trying to solve. And where do we get that from? Some people look at groups as like, we also have this feeling of we want our group to survive even if we don't survive. I would maybe look more at compassion, empathy, sympathy. Sometimes we just are weird in the, not weird, but sometimes for whatever reason, we just happen to care about what happens to others. And then that becomes our goal, even if it doesn't help us. And so I think if I would continue Carrie's suggestion, I would say that maybe morality is not a tool for cooperation, but tool for care and cooperation. But I don't know. Yeah, what is morality a tool for? Do you think that it's enough to say that it's a tool for cooperation, and if so, what do you think of self-sacrificial behavior, other kind of behavior that doesn't really seem to benefit yourself in the long run?
But yeah, no, I don't think of it as a tool for cooperation. I think morality does subserve that capacity in humans, and that's probably a core part of the explanation of why we have these aptitudes or capacities. But there's a lot to morality that's beyond this, and a lot that's not particularly tied to self-interest. And we see that again in infants fairly young. They will correct qualities in distribution of gummy bears when they're not one of them individuals. So humans obviously are just enlightened, self-interested creatures. I think Hume was right when he said, "Look, we are a mixture of motivational dispositions. There's some self-interest. There is some limited generosity, as he called it. That's like familial interests or interest among friends. But then there's just this general thing that we model each other's behavior, and we, in general, are quite capable of sympathizing with other individuals when things go well for those individuals. And when you're watching a movie, you want to see certain. He talked about literature, of course. You want to see certain outcomes, not because there's anything in it for you or for your relatives or whatever, but because you have favorable attitude toward the person. It's not because of self-interest or kin selection. It's because we have this capacity to identify with other individuals, to simulate their states. And as we do that, enter into them, and we feel some of the features of those states.
But what about then going back to utilitarianism? What do you think of the solution to the question of what is morality good for? Well, morality is different kind of rules that try to maximize happiness, or various kinds of norms, and the norms are, well, in some contexts you need this rule to maximize happiness, or I think even more powerfully, maybe minimize suffering. In some context you reduce suffering by having this kind of a norm. In other contexts you have that kind of a norm to minimize suffering. But at the end of the day, that is the only real goal, and any norm that exists for purposes that don't minimize suffering, maximize flourishing, whatever we want to call it, well, they are just going to be, either we call them amoral or we call them bad morals. I think many people would probably want to resort to that as the kind of ultimate judgment of why is it even possible to have moral progress, for example, away from slavery or whatnot. Is that the answer?
Well, it's hard to know how to use the word goal here. It will often not be the goal of any particular behavior to maximize utility or minimize suffering. And I'm not even sure that is the goal the sole goal we should fix on.
Okay.
If I were a business person looking at consequentialism, I'd say, well, yes, of course, a firm might want to maximize profit, but if it does so in a way that accumulates more and more risk, then it's not behaving in a prudent manner. And so it's not just a matter of maximizing profit, it's a matter of acting in such ways that you have a certain resilience when things go differently from the way that you're expecting them to go. So morality has a lot to do with that. And problems of mutual assurance, and we need to have trust within the corporation, or.
So would that be your explanation of kind of why is it probably not a good idea to start pushing large gentlemen on the trolley tracks? Is that, yes, you might maximize one outcome, but you are playing into the hands of a kind of vigilante justice, which in the long run will erode social trust and therefore won't even be in the long run the most utilitarian outcome. Would that be your answer?
That is part of the answer, and a big part of it. If you ask our students, well, suppose it takes more than the weight of this one large gentleman to stop the trolley. Suppose your weight and that man's weight would be sufficient.
Yes.
Suppose someone decides in that circumstance to grab onto the large gentleman and jump. Much more favorable response. And yeah, and so you say a lot's going on in these cases about human relations. And if you're willing to make the same sacrifice, then it does not seem as unreasonable for you to demand it. And you have to have more people saved, 10 people saved instead of 5, because you've got now 2 victims. But if you think of it in those terms, you'll think, yeah, there'll be lots of situations that call for something like that. And we need to be capable of, a whole range of actions in order to meet the demands. What happens when there's a violent and aggressive society? We have to have dispositions that will help us respond to that. And I think the ability to self-sacrifice or jointly sacrifice is going to be important for that, and people show it all over. So I would say there isn't a single answer here, and obviously different situations bring out different aspects of human dynamics and affective responses. But yes, there's this very big fact, which is that we are capable of large-scale collaboration with groups that we're biologically unrelated to, and that our responses in many of these cases don't look like a self-interested, even rationally self-interested response.
Yeah, nor kind of silly heuristic emotion that we should try to override.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have to override emotion in lots of cases, and we have to worry about heuristics. I actually think many heuristics are features of the so-called system 2. It's because when we try to think consciously about a problem, you can't keep everything in mind at once. And so you tend to fix on one or two particular features, and then you have some simple way of dealing with that. But your implicit system can take in dozens of features and does constantly. So yeah, we have to worry about heuristics, and we have to worry about creeping self-interest and self-delusion, and especially we have to worry about ideologies. Um, so, it's not necessarily a rosy picture of the world, but in terms of fundamental aptitudes, I think something like this is going to be a very plausible story.
Well, you mentioned being a trustworthy person as a kind of maybe one of the things that is a kind of guiding light in what people think is acceptable to do is well, what is acceptable to do is what a trustworthy good person would do. Now, that reminds me a lot of virtue ethics, or more generally various kinds of character ethics. I think I mentioned to you before we started that I studied Chinese philosophy as my master's, and in the kind of Confucian morals, it's, I hear the word character ethics more than virtue ethics, but basically it's very similar things. So the point of ethics should be the cultivation of a certain kind of character, rather than focusing on individual acts like a lot of modern philosophy tends to do. We should focus on this kind of, what kind of a person do I want to be. Philippa, who we started with, was one of the very famous, I think, virtue ethicists of the 20th century. So has our discussion proven, if not the moral value of virtue ethics, and at least the kind of, that's what people tend to do without realizing when they face moral dilemmas, is that they approach it like a virtue ethicist, like a character ethicist, like Aristotle would want them, like Philippa would want them, like Confucius would want them, which is, what kind of a person do I want to be?
Well, I think that's a big part of it, and that it helps explain these seemingly paradoxical responses to a lot of the situations we've been discussing. I don't think that's the whole of morality, and we need a moral theory to help us say, well, which things are the virtues? And
yes, because I mean, there's a bit of circularity in saying the good thing to do is what a good person would do.
exactly. Or you need, where do we get these ideas about what's better or worse for people? And so that's a big part of ethics as well, theory of value. But in terms of something like theory of right action, the part, like what would be the right thing to do in these circumstances, it seems that indeed a lot of our judgments about what's the right thing to do in these circumstances are mediated by some kind of judgment like this involving motives. But there will also be moral cases in which you need a bastard to do the thing that needs to be done. And again, that's why when you look at these cases, it's almost never 100%. And many people who study these evolutionary questions would say this is a mixed strategy. Humans don't just have this way of approaching it, they have multiple ways of approaching it. And it's because they have multiple ways of approaching it that they're able to solve a host of problems which they wouldn't get if they had just one or the other. And so there'll be lots of things that only people who are less than ideally altruistic and full of fellow feeling and sympathy, that they could do, that such a highly altruistic person couldn't bring themselves to do, but that are vitally important. And so we should get away from this idea of, well, there's going to be one answer here, and think, what would a mixture of strategies look like, given the kinds of complex social, interpersonal, and personal problems people need to solve.
But am I right that you want to leave a space for genuine moral progress, that it's not just that whatever people say is going to be okay? I mean, I've heard you talk, for example, about gay rights as an example of moral progress. And could that be seen as a way of having this character ethics, virtue ethics in action, in that one of the reasons people have become much more accepting of gay rights is that because more and more people have come out to saying, I am gay. Therefore, people have started seeing more and more trustworthy people that they have trusted be gay, and then be like, oh, wait, trustworthy people are gay, therefore there's something wrong with being gay. How much do you think that is part of the puzzle, not just a kind of utilitarian, I have no this is not a harmful thing for anyone, therefore I should accept it. But also this kind of virtue-based, very virtuous people seem to be homosexual, so there's nothing wrong with being homosexual. How much do you think, descriptively, how much do you think that is part of the history of the gay rights acceptance?
I think is a big part, and from the literature on this that I'm aware of, the suggestion is, that people coming out, having the nerve, the courage to come out, maybe to their close relatives or their friends, maybe to society more broadly, for the first time gave the rest of the population an idea of whether these gay people, are they some kind of strange, aberrant human form, or are they actually like my sister? And that enables them to learn something they didn't know before. And certainly when I was brought up, the only images I had of homosexual communities were atrocious, thanks to the dominant religious and ideological views of the time. And so my capacity for sympathy and empathy and generalized understanding needed more evidence. And that's what the courage of gay individuals created. So yes, I would say that's an example of learning. And that's why it could proceed so widely and so quickly, because it turned out that we all had experiences, gay people, straight people, bisexual people, had all had experience involving one another, and that gave us a common basis of understanding. So you could say, here's a prejudice that existed for millennia, and yet it could be overcome precisely because it's not that we have a module. Some people say, well, there's this inherent disgust module that people have, something like, it's not that. And instead, there's this capacity for learning and understanding.
Okay, well, before we end, one final question, which is, how has all your research and teaching, how has it shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, that's a tough question to answer at this particular moment, because there's so much going on in the contemporary world that would not encourage a positive picture of the capacities of humanity to meet the real problems that we face and solve them together in ways that are fair and beneficial. But what it has done first is, when I was younger, I was kind of drawn. I mean, I was an elitist when I was younger, and I was kind of drawn to theories that portrayed ordinary thought and ordinary people as in some ways not highly thoughtful, reflective, capable, so on. Fortunately, 1960s happened, and I realized that I was just had my head in a bucket of water on all those questions, and that there was a tremendous amount of understanding and wisdom in all parts of the population, and that the easy dismissal of large sections of the population was a serious mistake. And so since then, I've been on a little bit of a personal journey of trying to vindicate people's capacities, not because they will always display their best capacities or have the best results or anything like that, but because there's such a strong tendency in the intellectual community to be dismissive, to try to explain things in terms of higher and lower and rational and emotional, reasoned and unthinking. That's such a strong tendency. And there are certain words that now I just don't hear them the way I would have heard them when I was young. Someone said, this is just a gut feeling. I said, well, it's not just your gut feeling. You actually have a complex understanding of the situation in many cases. And so I'd say the way it's affected my views of humanity is probably, it like everyone else, I'm sure I'm guilty of believing what it suits me to believe in many ways, but it has chastened me, and I hope given me some kind of counterweight to these kinds of cultural tendencies and a better understanding of respecting the capacities of our fellow humans, but also, of animals. A lot of this literature shows the tremendous capabilities of animals and their active mental life. And so it's just been a question of this wonderful, delightful discovery over time that there is a tremendous amount going on in the human mind, the animal mind, that makes sense, and that even in situations where people end up adopting political views I don't like or really strongly oppose, there are interesting explanations. And so it's made me less dismissive, I hope.
Professor Peter Railton, thank you so much for your time today and all the research and beautiful final answer. I hope I can embody some of that in my life from now on.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for your questions and your interest. And, again, this research is only a fraction is my own, and all of it's, subject to debate and so on. But it has been for me a very gratifying journey. And just to put in a plug, it also has strengthened my sense that philosophy has something to say.
So that was it for today. Thank you for sticking with us until the very end. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. If you want more of the similar material, you might enjoy episode 2, one of the very early ones with Philippa Kitcher, one that I mentioned in this conversation. Or if you want to hear more about the development of morality in young children, there's a full episode on that, episode 22 with psychologist Amrisha Beish, a longtime collaborator with Michael Tomasello, whose name we mentioned in this conversation. If you enjoy this, please do make sure to subscribe to On Humans. And finally, if you want to support the show, one more time, the place to head to is patreon.com/onhumans. But anyway, most importantly, I hope that you enjoyed this and you will tune in next time. Until then, take care.